In a dusty Atlanta courtroom, thick with July heat, Officer Victor Grayson smirks as Tasha Coleman, a black woman in a crisp navy suit, steps to the stand. He assumes she's a nobody, just another snitch to crush, blind to her truth, a top FBI investigator who's tracked his corruption for 2 years. The crowd hushes, expecting his win, but her steady eyes promise his ruin. He laughs, oblivious that this sparks a war he'll lose. What will her next move unleash? Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from, and if you stand for justice, hit like and subscribe for more gripping tales. Sweat trickled down Tasha Coleman's neck as she stood behind the counter of Brewed Awakening, a cramped coffee shop nestled in a gritty Atlanta suburb where the air smelled of exhaust and desperation. It was 6 weeks before that courtroom showdown, and the late June sun blazed through cracked windows, turning the linoleum sticky under her sneakers. She wore a faded apron over her jeans, her hair pulled into a tight bun, playing the part of a barista with a practiced ease that hid her real mission. For months she'd been deep undercover, a ghost in this rundown strip mall, watching, waiting, listening. Her target? Officer Victor Grayson, a towering figure in a pressed blue uniform who strutted through the door at exactly 3:15, his boots thudding like a drumbeat of authority. He was a local legend, 20 years on the force, with a chest full of medals and a reputation for keeping the streets clean. Clean, Tasha thought bitterly, if you ignored the blood on his hands. Grayson leaned against the counter, his broad frame casting a shadow over the chipped formica, and flashed a grin. That didn't reach his cold grey eyes. "Black coffee, strong, none of that weak stuff," he barked, his voice carrying a drawl that grated on her nerves. She nodded, keeping her face neutral, and turned to pour the steaming liquid, her fingers brushing the tiny recorder taped beneath. The register. This was her chance. Across the room, Mr. Evans, a wiry black man in his 50s who owned the pawn shop next door, hunched over a table, his shoulders tense. Grayson sauntered over, dropping into the chair opposite him with a thud that rattled the salt shakers. "Time to pay up, old man," he said, loud enough for Tasha to hear every word. $5,000 cash, or I can't guarantee your little dump stays safe." Tasha's pulse quickened as she slid the coffee onto the counter, her eyes flicking to the exchange. Mr. Evans stammered, his voice low and shaky. "I barely made rent last month, officer. Business is slow. I can't—" Grayson cut him off, with a laugh, sharp and cruel. "Slow? Maybe if you people didn't turn this place into a ghetto, you'd have customers. Pay up by Friday or I'll have the health inspector shut you down. Rats, you know, they love spots like yours." The words dripped with venom, a racist jab that made Tasha's jaw tighten. She'd seen this game before. Grayson targeted black-owned businesses, shaking them down with threats, while white-owned stores across the street thrived, their windows gleaming, their owners unbothered by his shadow. It was a system, a quiet war waged with badges and bribes, and she was here to end it. She adjusted the recorder, capturing every syllable as Grayson stood, towering over Mr. Evans, who shrank into his seat. "Friday," he repeated, then grabbed his coffee and swaggered out, the bell above the door jangling like a taunt. Tasha exhaled, her mind racing. This was gold, the first hard evidence after months of dead ends. Grayson's corruption wasn't just whispers anymore. She had his voice, his demands, his racism on tape. She finished her shift, the recorder burning a hole in her pocket, and slipped into the alley behind the shop. The air stank of garbage and motor oil, but she barely noticed, her fingers trembling as she pulled out her burner phone. She dialed. Her FBI handler, Agent Lara Simmons, a no-nonsense woman with a voice like steel. "I've got him," Tasha whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "Extortion, clear as day. 5,000 from Evans' pawn shop, due Friday." Lara's reply crackled through the line. "Good work, Coleman. Send it over, we'll get it processed tonight. This could be the break we need." Tasha nodded to herself, slipping the recorder into a waterproof bag and stashing it in a rusted mailbox, their usual drop spot. She headed home, a cramped one-bedroom apartment 3 miles away, the kind of place where the walls were thin and the roaches bold. She locked the door, double-checked the deadbolt, and sank onto the sagging couch, a rare smile tugging at her lips. 2 years of chasing Grayson, 2 years of late nights and fake smiles, and now she had him. He'd been untouchable, a cop with a knack for dodging scrutiny, his arrest numbers so high the brass never questioned the bruises on suspects or the cash that vanished from evidence lockers. But not anymore. She closed her eyes, imagining his face when the cuffs clicked. That smirk wiped clean. Sleep came fast, a shallow drift broken by the buzz of her phone at 2 in the morning. She jolted upright, the room pitch black save for the glowing screen. It was Lara. "Tasha, we've got a problem," her handler said, her tone tight. "The recording's gone. Clerk at the evidence locker says it never showed up. Someone intercepted it." Tasha's stomach dropped, cold dread pooling in her gut. "Intercepted? How? That drop was clean." Lara sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. "We don't know yet. Could be a leak, could be Grayson's got eyes inside. Stay sharp, we'll figure it out." The call ended, leaving Tasha staring at the ceiling, her triumph souring into fear. If Grayson had the tape, he knew someone was watching. If he didn't, someone else was covering his tracks. Either way, she was exposed. She barely had time to process it when the floorboards creaked outside her door. Her breath caught, every nerve firing as she grabbed the Glock from under her pillow. A shadow moved past the window, too tall, too deliberate to be a neighbor. Then came the crash, glass shattering as a brick sailed through, landing with a thud on her carpet. She ducked, gun raised, as footsteps pounded away into the night. Heart hammering, she crept to the wreckage, glass crunching under her bare feet. The brick sat there, heavy and jagged, with words scrawled in white paint. "Noan, bitch, back off." Spray paint streaked her walls too, more slurs in dripping red, turning her sanctuary into a hate-filled canvas. She stood frozen, the gun trembling in her grip, the recorder's loss now a distant ache compared to this. Grayson's crew had found her, and this was just the start. Her phone buzzed again, a text from an unknown number. "We know where you sleep." She stared at it, the words searing into her brain, and realized the war she'd sparked wasn't waiting for the courtroom. It was here now, and Grayson wasn't playing subtle. She stumbled to the kitchen, splashing water on her face, her mind racing to recalibrate. The tape was gone, her cover shaky, but she wasn't done. She'd seen his face, heard his threats, felt his venom firsthand. This wasn't just about Mr. Evans anymore, it was personal. She grabbed a duffel, stuffing clothes and her backup recorder inside, knowing she couldn't stay. The apartment was a target, a bullseye painted by Grayson's goons, and every second she lingered risked more than just her mission. She slipped, out the back. The night thick with humidity and the hum of distant sirens, her sneakers silent on the cracked pavement. A safe house waited 10 miles north, a nondescript spot the FBI kept off the books. She'd regroup there, call Lara, figure out how to hit back. But as she reached her beat-up sedan, parked under a flickering streetlight, she froze. The tires were slashed, deep gashes weeping air, and a note taped to the windshield fluttered in the breeze. She ripped it free, her blood running cold as she read, "Run all you want, we'll find you." Grayson's laugh echoed in her memory, that same smug edge from the coffee shop, now a promise of ruin. She tossed the note, adrenaline surging, and sprinted into the shadows, the safe house her only lifeline. The trek took hours, her legs burning as she dodged streetlights and ducked into alleys, the weight of her duffel digging into her shoulder. Dawn was breaking, a thin pink line over the skyline when she reached the safe house, a squat brick building behind a gas station. She punched the code into the lockbox, slipped inside, and collapsed against the door, her breath ragged. The place smelled of dust and stale coffee, a single bulb buzzing overhead, but it was secure. She checked the windows, locked the deadbolt, and pulled out her phone, dialing Lara again. "They hit my place," she said, her voice low and hard. "Slashed my tires, trashed everything. They know I'm onto them." Lara cursed under her breath. "Grayson's moving fast. We'll get you a new drop, double security. You've got enough to keep going." Tasha nodded, though Lara couldn't see it. "Yeah, I've got his scent now. He's not slipping this." She hung up, staring at the bare walls, the slurs still vivid in her mind. That tape was supposed to be her ace, her ticket to nailing him clean. Now it was ash, and her apartment was a war zone. But she wasn't some rookie to scare off. She'd spent 2 years building this case, infiltrating his world, and she'd be damned if a brick and some paint stopped her. Grayson thought he'd won this round, thought he'd sent her running. He had no idea the storm she was brewing, the evidence she'd claw back, the reckoning she'd bring. She unzipped her duffel, pulled out her backup recorder, and whispered to the empty room, "You're mine, bastard." Tasha Coleman slumped against the peeling wall of the safe house, the faint hum of a gas station neon sign bleeding through the blackout curtains. It was 3 days after Grayson's crew trashed her apartment, and the July heat clung to her, skin like a second layer, even in the pre-dawn quiet. Her Glock rested on the rickety table beside her, next to a lukewarm cup of instant coffee that tasted more like regret than caffeine. She'd barely slept, her mind churning with the sting of that lost recording and the slurs still etched into her memory. But she wasn't broken, not yet. She'd moved fast, ditched the barista gig, and gone full ghost. Her burner phone now, her lifeline to Lara and the FBI. Grayson thought he'd scared her off, but he'd only lit a fire. What kind of man targets a pawnshop owner just trying to survive? She'd find out how deep his rot went, and she'd bury him with it. She powered up her laptop, the screen casting a pale glow across the bare room, and pulled up encrypted files she'd been building for months. Grayson wasn't just alone. Wolf. He had strings, puppet masters who kept him untouchable. Her fingers flew across the keys, cross-referencing tips from informants, and landed on a name, Leonard Price, a city councilman with a slick smile and a history of pushing urban renewal that always seemed to bulldoze black neighborhoods. Digging deeper, she found payments, subtle but consistent, funneled from Price's campaign funds to an offshore account Grayson controlled. 5,000 here, 10,000 there, all tied to consulting fees. Consulting for what? Tasha smirked bitterly. Keeping black folks in line, that's what. Price wanted land, Grayson delivered fear, and together they were carving Atlanta into a whitewashed profit machine. She needed proof, something undeniable. Price's office sat in a glassy downtown tower, 15 miles from the safe house. A fortress of privilege guarded by keycards and cameras. But Tasha had spent 2 years learning how to slip through cracks. She waited until night fell, the city buzzing with cicadas and distant traffic, then pulled on a black hoodie and gloves, her breath steady as she mapped her move. Could a councilman really be this dirty, or was Grayson the mastermind pulling Price along? She'd find out tonight. She hitched a ride with a burner app, a silent cabbie dropping her 2 blocks from the tower, and scaled a fire escape, her sneakers gripping the rusted metal. The 10th floor window was her target, a maintenance latch she'd scoped weeks ago. She jimmied it open with a pocket knife, slipping inside to a hallway thick with the scent of lemon polish. Price's office was a shrine to ego, mahogany desk, framed awards, a photo of him shaking hands with the governor. Tasha moved fast, planting a tiny audio bug under the desk's lip. Its signal synced to her phone. She was out in 6 minutes, heart pounding but steps silent, back to the safe house by 2 in the morning. The bug paid off at noon the next day. Her phone chirped, and she listened as Price's nasal voice filled the room, Grayson's growl joining in over speakerphone. "We need that community center gone," Price snapped. "Prime real estate, and those people don't deserve it." Grayson chuckled, low and mean. "Got it covered. Fake drug bust tomorrow night. Call it a gang hub, scare 'em out. Cops will back me up." Tasha's fists clenched. The center was a lifeline for black kids, a place she'd tutored at as a teen, now a pawn in their racist chess game. She couldn't let it happen. Who profits when a community's heart gets ripped out? She copied the audio, sent it to Lara, with a note, "Price and Grayson demolition plot, we can stop this." Then she called Marcus Tate, a wiry activist with a megaphone and a following, someone she'd met undercover who hated Grayson as much as she did. "Meet me," she said. Voice clipped. "Got something big." They linked up at a diner off Peachtree, the air thick with grease and whispers. Marcus slid into the booth, his dreads brushing his shoulders, eyes sharp. "What you got, barista girl?" She played the audio, watching his face harden with every word. "That's my niece's center," he growled. "They're not touching. Tasha nodded. Leak it. Get people in the streets. Stall them. Marcus moved like lightning. By dusk, protests erupted outside the center, a sea of signs and chants. No more lies. Protect our kids. News vans rolled up, cameras flashing as cops hovered uneasy. Tasha watched from a rooftop a block away, her hoodie pulled low, a flicker of hope sparking. The bust was postponed, the mayor mumbling excuses on live TV. She'd done it, turned the tide, stopped Grayson cold. She slipped back to the safe house, adrenaline buzzing, and poured herself a rare glass of bourbon. For the first time in weeks, she felt the scales tip her way. Could a protest really rattle? A man like Grayson? She toasted the empty room, savoring the burn, believing she'd landed a solid punch. That belief shattered at midnight. Her phone lit up, Lara's name flashing. "Tasha, it's Jamal," her handler said, voice tight. "He's in lockup. Grayson's boys nabbed him an hour ago, planted dope in his car, $50,000 bail." Tasha's glass slipped, shattering on the floor, bourbon pooling like blood. Jamal, her baby brother, 22 and clean, a mechanic with dreams of his own shop. She'd kept him out of this, or so she thought. "Planted?" she choked out. "So they're framing him?" Lara sighed. "Looks like payback. Grayson's hitting where it hurts." Tasha's vision blurred, rage and guilt colliding. She'd saved the center, but Grayson had struck back, harder, crueler, using her family as a weapon. She stormed to the precinct, a squat brick bunker glowing under sodium lights, her hoodie swapped for a blazer to look legit. The desk sergeant, a paunchy white guy with a buzz cut, sneered as she demanded answers. "Your brother's a dealer, lady. Caught him red-handed." Lies, thick and smug, dripping with the same racism Grayson wielded like a club. "I want to see him," she snapped, slamming her ID down, not her FBI badge, just enough to bluff. He shrugged, buzzing her through, and she found Jamal in a cell, his lips split, eye swollen shut. "Tash," he mumbled, voice thick with pain. "They jumped me, said it's your fault." Her heart cracked, but she forced a nod. "I'm getting you out. Hold tight." Back at the safe house, she called Lara, pacing like a caged animal. "They beat him, Lara. Grayson's sending a message." Her handler's voice was grim. "We'll pull strings, get him a hearing. But Tasha, this is war now." She hung up, staring at the Bugs live feed, Price's voice droning about tightening the screws. War. Fine. Grayson wanted to play dirty, she'd play dirtier. She'd saved the center, thought she'd won, but he'd turned her victory to ash. How far would a cop go to break a black woman who dared fight back? She grabbed her laptop, plotting. Her next strike, knowing this was just the beginning. If you think Grayson's crossed a line hitting Tasha's family, comment number 1 below. Agree that Tasha's got the guts to take him down. Hit that like button. Want to see her flip this mess back on him? Subscribe now for the next drop. What's Tasha cooking up to make Grayson regret touching Jamal? How's she going to claw her way out of this trap? Tasha Coleman's boots echoed on the concrete as she paced the safe house, the stale air heavy with the scent of dust and her own sweat. It was 2 days after Jamal's arrest, and the July heat pressed against the walls like a living thing, mirroring the fury boiling in her chest. Her brother was still locked up, his bruised face haunting her every thought, a pawn in Grayson's twisted game. She'd spent hours on the phone with Lara, pulling every FBI string she could reach, calling in favors from agents who owed her. By noon, she'd secured a hearing, a sliver of hope in the chaos. She showered fast, swapped her hoodie for a sharp blazer, and drove a borrowed sedan to the precinct, her knuckles white on the wheel. This wasn't just about Jamal anymore. It was about proving Grayson couldn't break her. The hearing room was a cramped box, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The judge, a gray-haired white man with a permanent scowl. Jamal sat in an orange jumpsuit, wrists cuffed, his swollen eye barely open. Tasha's stomach twisted, but she kept her face stone, sitting in the back as Lara's contact, a wiry public defender named Ellis, took the floor. "Your Honor," Ellis said, voice steady, "the evidence against Jamal Coleman is fabricated. No prints on the bag, no witnesses, just a convenient stop by Officer Grayson's squad." The judge grunted, flipping through papers while the prosecutor, a slick guy with a cheap tie, smirked like he'd already won. "Convenient?" he shot back. We caught him with 10 ounces of cocaine, open and shut. Lies, Tasha thought, her nails digging into her palms. Grayson's crew had planted it, a racist setup to punish her for daring to fight. Ellis didn't flinch. We've got dashcam footage showing the stop. No bag in sight until after they pulled him out. It's a frame job. The judge squinted, leaning forward, and Tasha held her breath. After 20 minutes of back and forth, the gavel cracked. Bail reduced to 5,000, case pending review, the judge muttered, clearly annoyed. Tasha exhaled, a shaky victory. She posted the cash with FBI funds wired through a dummy account, and by dusk, Jamal stumbled out of the precinct, free but battered. She caught him as he swayed, his arms wrapping around her in a hug that smelled of sweat and relief. I knew. You'd get me, he rasped, voice raw. She squeezed him tight, tears pricking her eyes. Always, little man. They stood there, the sky bruising purple over Atlanta, and for a moment she let herself believe she'd won this round. Grayson's frame-up had crumbled, and Jamal was safe. She glanced around, scanning for threats, and spotted Grayson's cruiser parked across the lot, his silhouette slouched behind the wheel. His eyes glinted, cold and unblinking, locking onto hers. A chill snaked down her spine, but she turned away, guiding Jamal to the sedan. "Let's get you home," she said, forcing calm into her tone. She drove him to a friend's place 10 miles south, a spot Grayson didn't know, and left him with a burner phone and strict orders to lay low. Back at the safe house, she sank onto the couch, exhaustion tugging at her bones. She'd beaten. Him this time pulled Jamal from his claws. Maybe she could breathe. That illusion lasted 12 hours. The next night she hit the streets, her mission sharper than ever. Grayson wasn't just a cop, he was a virus, and she needed more than a lost tape to kill him. She headed to Rusty's, a dive bar 5 miles from the precinct, a hangout for off-duty cops and lowlifes. She wore a leather jacket and jeans, her backup recorder tucked into her bra, its tiny mic wired to catch every word. Grayson was there, sprawled in a booth, his uniform swapped for a faded polo that strained over his gut. He laughed with 2 buddies, their voices loud over the jukebox's wail. Tasha slid onto a stool at the bar, sipping a soda, her back to him, but her ears sharp. He didn't disappoint. "That Coleman kid's out," he grumbled, his drawl thick with beer. "His sister's a pain, but I'll teach her family a lesson they won't forget." His buddies chuckled, one clapping him on the shoulder. "You always do, Vic." "Keep." "Say I'm in line." Tasha's blood ran hot, the racism casual but cutting, a reminder of why she'd joined the FBI. She angled her body, the recorder humming, catching his next words. "She thinks she's smart poking around. Next time it's not just jail, she'll see what happens when you cross me." A threat, clear and personal, aimed straight at her. She paid her tab, slipped out, and uploaded the audio to Lara from a gas station lot, her hands steady despite the rage simmering beneath. "This is gold," Lara said over the phone, her voice crackling with excitement. "Admissible, direct, ties him to the frame-up. We've got him, Tasha." She nodded, leaning against the sedan, the night air cooling her skin. "File it tonight," she said. "I want him sweating." Lara agreed, and Tasha drove back to the safe house, a grim satisfaction settling in. She submitted the tape through a secure drop, a new mailbox 10 blocks away, and crashed hard, dreaming of Grayson's face when the feds came knocking. She'd turned his taunts into a noose, and this time it'd stick. Morning broke, grey and humid, and she woke to Lara's call. "It's in," her handler said. "DA's got it, pushing for a warrant. You nailed him." Tasha grinned, splashing water on her face, ready to plan the next strike. She'd freed Jamal, turned Grayson's threats against him, and now the law was closing in. She stepped outside, the safe house door creaking shut, and froze. A plume of smoke curled over the skyline, black and thick, 10 miles south. Her phone buzzed, Jamal's number flashing. "Tash!" he yelled when she answered, his voice high with panic. "My place, it's on fire. Someone threw a bottle through the window." Her heart stopped, the world tilting. "Get out now!" she barked, already running to the sedan. "I'm coming!" She floored it, tires squealing. The 10-mile drive a blur of red lights and honking horns. She reached Jamal's friend's house, a clapboard shack in a quiet black neighborhood, and found him coughing on the lawn, safe but shaken. Flames licked the walls, glass shattered across the grass, the air reeking of gasoline. Neighbors gaped. Phones out as sirens wailed closer. Tasha knelt beside him, her hands on his shoulders. "You okay?" He nodded, eyes wide. "It happened so fast, I barely got out." She scanned the wreckage, spotting a scorched note pinned to a tree. "Next time, we aim higher." Her gut twisted, Grayson's voice from the bar echoing in. Her skull. Cops rolled up, Grayson among them, stepping out of his cruiser with that same damn smirk. He strolled over, hands in his pockets, ignoring the fire like it was a barbecue. "Rough night, huh?" he said, his tone dripping with mock pity. "Should have stayed out of my business." Tasha stood, fists clenched, staring him down. "You did this?" she hissed, low enough the others couldn't hear. He shrugged, eyes glinting. "Prove it." He sauntered off, barking orders to the fire crew, leaving her seething in the smoke. Jamal grabbed her arm. "Tash, he's crazy. What's he gonna do next?" She didn't answer, her mind racing. She'd thought the tape was checkmate, thought she'd caged him, but the DA had buried it, claiming insufficient context. Grayson's allies, white men in suits, had snuffed her win, and now he'd struck back, nearly killing her brother. The fire wasn't just revenge, it was a promise. She pulled Jamal to the sedan, driving him to a new hideout, a Motel 20, miles west, her silence heavy with fury. She'd saved him once, thought she'd won twice, but Grayson's reach was a hydra, every head she cut sprouting two more. He'd burned Jamal's life to ash, and that note wasn't a bluff. Next time, he'd aim higher, and she knew exactly who he meant. Tasha Coleman sat cross-legged on the motel floor, the cheap carpet scratching her knees, a flickering lamp casting jagged shadows across the room. It was 3 nights after the fire that nearly swallowed Jamal, and the July air outside the motel, 20 miles west of Atlanta, buzzed with mosquitoes and the weight of her failure. Her brother slept fitfully on the sagging bed, his breath shallow, a bandage over the burn on his arm. That Molotov cocktail, Grayson's vicious retaliation, had turned her victory into smoke, and the note's threat, "Next time, we aim higher," looped in her mind like a siren. She'd moved Jamal here, a dingy hideout off a forgotten highway, but safety felt like a lie. Grayson wasn't done. He was a predator, and she was bleeding prey. She rubbed her eyes, exhaustion gnawing at her bones, and pulled her laptop closer. The DA burying her bar recording was a gut punch, but she wasn't out. Grayson's empire ran deeper than threats and firebombs. It thrived on cash, dirty and steady, flowing from hands she hadn't touched yet. She'd tracked him for 2 years, knew his haunts, his habits. The precinct was his castle, and every castle had a vault. She hacked into old surveillance logs, favors from an FBI tech pal, and pinpointed a locker Grayson used, one he checked daily, but never logged. What was he hiding? She slipped into a black jacket, grabbed her lockpick set, and kissed Jamal's forehead. "Stay put," she whispered, slipping out into the humid night. The precinct loomed 15 miles east, a squat brick fortress glowing under sodium lights, its parking lot quiet at 2 in the morning. Tasha parked a block away, her borrowed sedan blending into the shadows, and crept through an alley, her pulse a steady drumbeat. She'd cased this place before, knew the back door's camera blind spot. A quick twist of her pick and she was in, the air inside thick with bleach and stale coffee. The locker room was down a dim hall, its metal rows glinting under a single bulb. Grayson's locker, number 47, sat in the corner, its padlock a cheap thing begging to be cracked. She worked fast, the click echoing like a gunshot, and swung it open. Inside, a leather ledger stared back, its pages yellowed, stuffed, with scribbled dates and dollar amounts. Her breath caught as she flipped through it, the numbers a roadmap to Grayson's soul. 10,000 from the Red Street crew, 15 from the Oakwood boys, all gangs he busted on paper while pocketing their cash. They shook down black teens, robbed corner stores, and Grayson let them roam, a racist pact to keep the streets bleeding and his wallet fat. She snapped photos with her phone, page after page, her hands trembling with the weight of it. This wasn't just evidence, it was a guillotine. She zipped it into her jacket, relocked the locker, and slipped out, the night swallowing her steps. Back at the motel, she uploaded the shots to Lara, her voice low on the burner call. "Got his ledger, bribes, names, dates, he's done." Lara's reply crackled with hope. "This is it, Tasha, we'll run a sting, nail him clean, sending it up now." Tasha nodded, pacing the room as dawn crept through the blinds, painting Jamal's face in soft gold. She'd turned Grayson's bar threat into nothing, and now this ledger was her ace. She imagined the raid, cuffs snapping on his wrists, that smirk melting into panic. She brewed coffee, the motel's cheap grounds bitter but grounding, and let herself believe it was over. The feds moved fast, Lara texting at 6. "Warrants out. Sting at 7. Tasha grinned, sipping her brew, watching the clock tick. Closer to justice. At 7 sharp, her phone buzzed with a live feed from an FBI drone, a perk of her rank. She saw Grayson's house, a squat ranch 10 miles north swarmed by black vans. Agents in vests stormed the porch, boots thudding, and dragged him out, his polo stained with coffee, his face a mask of shock. "You can't do this," he bellowed, thrashing as cuffs clicked. Tasha exhaled, a weight lifting, and hugged her knees, the screen flickering as they hauled him away. Jamal stirred, blinking at her. "What's happening?" She smiled, real this time. "He's gone, Jay. We got him." He grinned back, weak but alive, and she let herself breathe, the ledger's power sinking in. She'd won, finally. That relief lasted 4 hours. At 11, her phone rang, Lara's name flashing. "Tasha," her handler said, voice tight. "He's out." Technicality, some clerk screwed the warrant's timestamp. Judge tossed it. Tasha's coffee mug slipped, shattering on the floor, brown liquid pooling like the dread in her gut. "Out?" she choked. "He was in cuffs." Lara sighed, heavy and defeated. Price pulled strings, got a buddy to spring him. He's back on the street. Tasha's vision blurred, rage clawing up her throat. She'd had him, held his ruin, in her hands, and they'd snatched it away. Grayson's allies, white men with power, laughed at her justice like it was a joke. She slammed the laptop shut, pacing as Jamal watched wide-eyed. "Tash, what now?" She didn't answer, her mind racing. Grayson wouldn't slink off. He'd hit back, harder, meaner. She'd barely processed it when tires screeched outside. A black SUV peeling into the motel lot. Her Glock was in her hand before she thought, instinct screaming. The door burst open, 2 masked goons rushing in, reeking of gasoline and hate. "Where's the snitch?" one snarled, lunging for Jamal. Tasha fired, a warning shot cracking the ceiling, and they froze. "Out!" she roared, advancing, her voice steel. They bolted, cursing, but not before tossing a match at the curtains, flames licking up fast. She grabbed Jamal, dragging him through the back exit as smoke choked the room, the fire alarm shrieking. They stumbled into the lot, coughing, her arm around his waist. A crowd gathered, phones out as the motel burned, orange tongues devouring the cheap wood. Tasha scanned the chaos, spotting a figure by the SUV. Corey, a skinny black teen she'd flipped months ago, her best informant on Grayson's gang ties. He met her eyes, then bolted, terror in his gait. She cursed, knowing he'd sold her out, but before she could move, sirens wailed, cops swarming in. Grayson stepped out, smirking, like he'd scripted it, pointing at her. "That's the arsonist," he lied, loud and smug. "Cuff her." She dodged, pulling Jamal behind a dumpster, her mind spinning. The ledger, the sting, all for nothing. Grayson's goons had torched her hideout, and now he'd pinned it on her. She peeked out, seeing Corey vanish into an alley, and her gut sank. He wasn't running from her, he was running from them. Hours later, as she hid in a storm drain 5 miles away, Jamal shivering beside her, her phone buzzed. An unknown number sent a photo. Corey's body beaten to a pulp, dumped on her old apartment stoop. A note scrawled in blood. "You're next." Tasha's breath hitched, guilt and fury colliding. She'd thought she'd caged Grayson, but he'd slipped free, and now Corey was dead, a message carved in flesh. She clutched the phone, the drain's damp chill seeping into her bones. Grayson wasn't just a cop. He was a monster, and his reach was a noose tightening around her neck. She'd saved Jamal again, thought the ledger was her trump card, but Grayson's counterattack was a sledgehammer. Fire, death, and a frame-up. She couldn't shake. She looked at Jamal, his eyes hollow, and whispered, "I'll fix this." But how? Grayson's crew was hunting, Corey's blood on her hands, and every move she made seemed to fuel his wrath. She needed more than evidence now. She needed a miracle. If you think Grayson's gone too far killing Corey, comment number 1 below. Believe Tasha's got the strength to turn this nightmare around? Smash that like button. Want to see her strike back against this racist beast? Subscribe for the next chapter. What's Tasha's next play when the system keeps letting Grayson win? Can she outsmart a cop who turns every victory into a trap? Tasha Coleman crouched in the storm drain, the damp concrete chilling her knees as water trickled past, carrying the stench of rot and gasoline from the motel fire. It was dawn, 4 hours after Grayson's goons torched her hideout and dumped Corey's broken body as a warning, and the July sky above Atlanta glowed a sickly gray. Jamal shivered beside her, his breath fogging in the dim light, his burned arm trembling under its bandage. Corey's death clawed at her gut, a kid she'd promised to protect, now a corpse because she'd pushed too hard. She clutched her Glock, heart's weight a cold comfort, and stared at the photo on her phone. His lifeless eyes, the bloody note, "You're next." Grayson wasn't just winning, he was rewriting the rules, and she was running out of moves. She shoved the phone into her pocket, her mind racing. The ledger was still out there, uploaded to Lara, but Grayson's release on a technicality proved his allies ran deeper than she'd feared. She needed a knockout, something public, undeniable. A grand jury was her shot, a chance to air his filth where even Price couldn't bury it. She'd testified before, knew the drill, but this time it was personal. She whispered to Jamal, "Stay here, keep low. I've got a play." He nodded, eyes hollow, and she crawled out, the drains, mouth spitting her into a weedy ditch 5 miles west of the motel. She brushed mud off her jeans, pulled her hoodie tight, and hitched a ride to a payphone 10 blocks away, her burner too hot to risk. Lara picked up on the first ring, her voice taut. "Tasha, where are you?" "Corey's all over the news. They're calling it a gang hit." Tasha gritted her teeth. "Grayson's work. I'm alive, Jamal's safe, but I need a grand jury now. The ledger, the bar tape, everything." Lara paused, then said, "I'll push it through. Meet me at the Federal." "Building, noon." Tasha hung up, the clock ticking in her skull. She reached the building, a grey monolith downtown by 11:30, slipping into a side entrance where Lara waited, her sharp eyes scanning the hall. "You look like hell," Lara said, handing her a blazer. "Clean up. You're on in 20. Tratubi. Grand jury room buzzed with nervous energy. 23 jurors packed into wooden benches, the air thick with stale coffee and anticipation. Tasha took the stand, her navy blazer crisp despite the mud still caked on her sneakers, and swore the oath, her voice steady. The prosecutor, a lean black woman named Denise Carter, nodded her in. "Agent Coleman, tell us about Officer Victor." "Grayson." Tasha laid it bare. The extortion at Brood Awakening, the ledger's bribe list, the firebombing, Corey's murder. She played the bar audio, Grayson's voice snarling through the speakers. "She'll see what happens when you cross me." The room hushed, jurors leaning forward, some nodding, others scribbling notes. Denise pressed, "And the ledger." Tasha slid the photos across, each page a dagger. Proof he's been taking gang money for years, letting them prey on black kids while he cashes out. The jurors' faces hardened, a mix of shock and resolve. But then Judge Harold Vance, a wiry white man with a hawkish nose, cleared his throat from the bench. "Hold up," he said, voice dripping with skepticism. "We need a fair panel." He scanned the room, eyes narrowing, and dismissed 3 black jurors on flimsy pretexts. One looked biased, another knew the area too well. Tasha's stomach sank as replacements filed in, all white, 2 winking at Grayson's lawyer in the back. The deck was stacked, a racist shuffle to shield their golden boy. She kept going, her voice rising, detailing the motel attack, Corey's blood. "This isn't just corruption," she said, locking eyes with a juror who hadn't smirked. A war on us and he's the general. The session stretched 2 hours, the air growing heavy with her words. Denise wrapped up, confident, and the jurors filed out to deliberate. Tasha stepped into the hall, Lara at her side, the buzz of hope tingling in her veins. "You killed it," Lara said, clapping her shoulder. "They've got no choice now." At 4, the foreman returned, a stout woman with tired eyes, and handed Vance the verdict. "Indictment on all counts," she said, voice firm. Tasha exhaled, a grin breaking through her exhaustion. Grayson was done, pinned by his own greed. She walked out, the federal building's marble cool under her feet, and let herself believe it. She'd faced the system, spoken truth, and won. That triumph lasted 6 hours. At 10 that night she was back in the drain, Jamal asleep beside her, when her phone vibrated. Lara's voice was a whisper, laced with dread. "He's out, Tasha. Price called in a favor with the governor, posted bail an hour ago." Tasha's heart plummeted, the air turning to ice. "Bail? After that?" Lara cursed softly. "Yeah, $1 million, cash. They're untouchable." Tasha hung up, staring at the dripping walls, her victory ash in her mouth. She'd thought. The indictment was a lock, thought the system had finally bent. But Grayson's white cronies had yanked him free again, laughing at her fight. She barely slept, her mind replaying Vance's smirks, the winks, the bailout. At midnight, a boom shook the city, a distant thud she felt in her chest. She scrambled out, climbing a rusted ladder to street level, and saw smoke billowing 10 miles east, right where the federal building stood. Her phone buzzed, a news alert, screaming, "Grand jury room firebombed, evidence destroyed." She clicked the link, hands shaking, and watched grainy footage of flames devouring the marble halls, jurors fleeing in panic. The anchor's voice droned, "Authorities suspect black radicals led by fugitive Tasha Coleman in a revenge attack." Her face flashed on screen, a mugshot from her undercover days, now a wanted poster. She stumbled back into the drain, her, breath ragged, Jamal stirring awake. "What's wrong?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. She couldn't speak, the weight crushing her. Grayson hadn't just walked. He'd burned her world down. The fire wasn't random. It was surgical, wiping. The ledger, the tapes, her testimony, and pinning it on her, genius? She was the scapegoat, the angry black woman the news loved to hate, a racist lie spun to bury her alive. She checked her phone again, texts from Lara. "Feds are hunting you. Lay low." Grayson's crew had struck at midnight, a Molotov, cocktail through the evidence room window, and now every cop in Atlanta had her name. She sank against the wall, the Glock slipping from her grip, clattering on the concrete. Jamal grabbed her arm, his voice sharp. "Tash, talk to me," she forced words out, hoarse and broken. "They burned it all, blamed me, we're fugitives." His eyes widened, fear replacing exhaustion. "Grayson?" She nodded, the name a curse. She'd stood in that room, thought. She'd caged him, but he'd slipped free and turned her win into a death sentence. The judge's bias, the governor's cash, the fire, it was a machine, and she was its target. How did he keep winning? She'd saved Jamal, exposed the ledger, swayed the jury, and still he danced away, leaving her to drown. She pulled Jamal close, the drains damp, soaking her jeans, and checked her burner. A new message, unknown number. "Run, rat, we're coming." Her blood ran cold, Grayson's smirk vivid in her mind. He'd taken Corey, torched her case, and now he'd framed her as a terrorist, a racist myth to rally his troops. She'd thought the grand jury was her hammer, but he'd turned it to dust, and the hunt was on. She grabbed her gun, her resolve, hardening. "We move at dawn," she told Jamal, voice low. "He wants war, he's got it." But deep down she wondered, could she outrun a system built to crush her? Tasha Coleman crouched in the storm drain as dawn broke over Atlanta, the faint pink light seeping through the grate above, casting stripes across Jamal's sleeping face. The damp air clung to her skin, thick with the stench of mildew and the echo of last night's firebombing, a gut punch that turned her grand jury win into ashes. Her phone buzzed incessantly, news alerts painting her as a terrorist, a black radical who'd torched the federal building. Grayson's frame-up was a masterpiece, a racist lie that stuck like tar, and now every cop in the city had her name. She'd thought she'd caged him, but he'd slipped free, leaving her a fugitive in her own streets. She nudged Jamal awake, his eyes bleary but sharp with fear. "We're moving," she whispered, shoving her Glock into her waistband. "Now." They slipped out, the morning humid and still, her hoodie pulled low as they darted through alleys, the city waking around. Them. Sirens wailed in the distance, a constant hum that set her teeth on edge. She'd ditched the safe house, the motel, every tether, and now they were ghosts, running from a manhunt she couldn't outpace. The news blared from a corner store TV as they passed. Tasha Coleman, armed and dangerous, suspect in federal. "Hassan!" Her face flashed, a grainy shot from her barista days twisted into a snarl the media loved. She pulled Jamal behind a dumpster, her breath shallow. How did Grayson turn her truth into this? She was the hunter once, now the hunted, and the system cheered him on. She needed a lifeline. They hit a motel 15 miles south, a crumbling dive called the Starlight, its neon sign half dead. She paid cash for a room, the clerk too bored to glance at her face and lock them in, the walls paper-thin and stained yellow. Jamal collapsed on the bed, his voice low. "Tash, they're saying you're a bomber. What's next?" She paced, her mind a storm. "We fight back," she said, pulling her laptop from her bag. Price's bailout of Grayson was the key. If she could crack his moves, she'd flip this. She hacked into his email, a trick she'd learned from an FBI cyber unit, her fingers flying over the keys. What kind of councilman bails out a monster like Grayson? The inbox was a goldmine. She found a thread, Price to a burner account, time-stamped post-fire. She's done. Next step, silence her. 50,000 to the crew that brings her in, dead. Or alive. Tasha's blood ran cold, the bounty a death knell. Another email laid out Grayson's plan. Pin the fire, keep her running, end her quiet. She screenshotted it all, her pulse racing. This wasn't just revenge. It was extermination, a racist purge to erase her fight. She needed eyes on this, someone outside the system Grayson owned. She thought of Riley Voss, a rogue reporter she'd met undercover, a white guy with a blog and a grudge against crooked cops. Could he handle the heat of this truth? She slipped out, leaving Jamal, with strict orders, bolt if anyone knocks. She found a payphone 2 blocks away, the booth sticky with gum and despair, and dialed Riley. He picked up, voice gruff. "Who's this?" She kept it tight. "It's the barista. Got a story that'll burn Grayson down. Price too. Meet me. Midnight, old train yard." He grunted, intrigued. "Better be good." She hung up, the clock ticking toward midnight as she trekked back, her sneakers silent on cracked pavement. Riley was a risk, but she had no allies left. The feds were hunting her. Lara was radio silent, and Grayson's bounty turned every shadow into a threat. Midnight came. The train yard a sprawl of rust and weeds 10 miles east, the air thick with oil and silence. Riley waited by a derelict boxcar, his lanky frame hunched in a trench coat, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. She approached, hood up, and tossed him a USB with Price's emails. "Grayson's framing me," she said, voice low. "Firebomb was him, not me. Price bankrolled it. $50,000 hit on my head." Riley skimmed the files on his phone, eyes widening. "This is dynamite," he muttered, exhaling smoke. "I'll run it, front page tonight." She nodded, a spark of hope flickering. "Do it fast. They're closing in." Riley posted it at 2, his blog lighting up the dark web. Fugitive or framed? Cops' bounty exposed. By 3 it hit mainstream, news vans scrambling to catch the wave. Tasha watched from the motel, the TV flickering as anchors stumbled over Price's name, her mugshot fading from the lead. Riley's voice crackled. "On a live stream. She's no bomber. Grayson's the crook and Price is his wallet." Tasha exhaled, sinking onto the bed beside Jamal, who grinned weakly. "You did it, Tash." She nodded, the weight lifting. The story cleared her name, turned the heat on Grayson. She'd outsmarted him, flipped his frame up into a spotlight. Could this be the end of his reign? That hope died at 4. A crash splintered the motel door, wood flying as 3 masked men stormed in, guns drawn. Tasha lunged for her Glock, shoving Jamal behind her, but a barrel pressed to her temple froze her cold. "Move, and he's dead," one growled, nodding at Jamal. She dropped the gun, hands up as they zip-tied her wrists, the plastic biting her skin. They dragged her out, Jamal's scream echoing. "Tash!" She twisted, catching his eyes, mouthing, "Run!" before a hood slammed over her head, the world going black. Tires squealed, the van lurching as they sped off, her heart pounding against her ribs. Grayson's crew, she knew it. But how? Riley's story was live, her name cleared, yet here she was, bagged like prey. The van stopped after 20 minutes, the hood ripped off in a blur of sodium light. She blinked, squinting at a warehouse, its walls rusted and looming 15 miles north of the yard. Grayson stepped from the shadows, his smirk wide, a predator savoring the kill. "Thought you'd squeal to the press, huh?" he said, voice thick with scorn. "Price owns half the station, Story's dead and so are you." Her gut sank, the air reeking of oil and menace. She scanned the room, spotting Riley's body, slumped in a corner, blood pooling under his skull, a bullet hole stark in his forehead. She choked, guilt crashing over her. She'd trusted him, and Grayson had snuffed him out. Another black woman's ally turned to collateral. Grayson loomed closer, his breath sour with beer. "You're a rat in a maze, Coleman. Keep running. I keep winning." He nodded, and a goon grabbed her, slamming her into a chair, the metal cold against her back. She glared, defiance burning through the fear. "You're scared," she spat. "Truth's out, you can't hide." He laughed, a hollow sound, and kicked the chair, sending her crashing to the floor. "Truth. I am the truth. You're just a ghost now." He turned, barking orders, leaving her sprawled, zip ties cutting deeper. She'd cleared her name, thought she'd won, but Grayson's counterattack was a guillotine. Riley dead, her captured, Jamal alone. How deep did this go? If you agree Grayson's a coward hiding behind power, comment number 1 below. Think. Tasha's got the grit to escape this trap. Hit that like button. Want to see her turn this warehouse into his downfall? Subscribe for the next twist. Can Tasha outsmart a system that kills her allies and frames her every move? What's her next step when the walls close in tighter than ever? Tasha Coleman lay sprawled on the warehouse floor, the cold concrete biting into her cheek as Grayson's boots thudded away, his laughter echoing off the rusted walls. The zip ties cut into her wrists, blood trickling warm down her fingers, and Riley's lifeless body slumped 15 feet away, a stark reminder of her failure. It was past midnight, the July air thick with oil and despair, 15 miles north of the train yard where she'd last tasted hope. Grayson's goons had dragged her here after snuffing Riley's story, his corpse a message. No one crosses Victor Grayson and lives. Her chest heaved, rage and guilt warring inside her, but she wasn't done. She'd survived worse, and Jamal was out there counting on her. She twisted, scanning the dim space, the single bulb overhead flickering like a dying star. The goons were gone, Grayson too, leaving her alone with Riley's blood and her own. Racing thoughts. She needed out, needed help, and her mind locked on Marcus, her FBI partner of 3 years, a burly black man with a quiet strength she'd trusted through every storm. He'd been off-grid since the grand jury fire, but he'd know how to pull her from this abyss. She rolled, inching toward Riley's body, her bound hands fumbling until she found his phone, cracked but alive. She dialed Marcus, her voice a hoarse whisper when he answered. "It's me, warehouse north side, 15 miles from the yard. Grayson's got me, hurry." Marcus's reply was instant, steady. "Hold on, Tasha, I'm coming." She dropped the phone, shoving it under Riley with her foot, and waited, the minutes stretching into eternity. At 1, headlights pierced the grimy windows, a pickup rumbling into the lot. Marcus burst in, his frame filling the doorway, his Glock raised. "Tasha," he called, spotting her, and cut her ties with a pocket knife, his hands firm but gentle. She staggered up, rubbing her wrists, relief flooding her. "He killed Riley," she said, nodding at the body. "Framed me for the fire. We've got to move." Marcus nodded, grim, and led her to his basement, a safe spot 20 miles south. a bunker under his split-level house. The basement smelled of damp earth and motor oil, a bare bulb swinging overhead as Tasha sank onto a cot, her legs shaky but her mind sharp. Marcus handed her water, his eyes dark with worry. "You're a ghost now," he said. "News says you're a bomber, feds too. What's the play?" She gulped the water, cold against her parched throat, and pulled her laptop from her bag, miraculously intact. "Price's emails," she said. "Riley's dead, but the data's live. Grayson's got offshore accounts, millions stashed. We exposed that, he's toast." Marcus leaned in, watching her hack into a shadow server she'd set up months ago, a digital vault for her evidence. What had Grayson hidden in those accounts? Her fingers danced, pulling up records. Cayman Islands transfers, 10 million over 5 years, tied to Price's shell companies and Grayson's name. Drug money, gang. Cuts laundered through fake consulting gigs, all while he strutted as Atlanta's hero. She cross-checked the ledger photos, the numbers matching like a puzzle snapping shut. "This is it," she said, voice rising. "Feds can't ignore this, not with dates, banks, proof." Marcus grinned, clapping her shoulder. "You're a damn genius, Coleman. Send it up. Let's bury him." She nodded, uploading it to Lara's secure line, her heart pounding with the thrill of it. "Task force'll hit him hard," she said, picturing the raid. Grayson's smirk fading as SWAT stormed in. Lara's reply pinged at 3. "Got it. Offshore's a slam dunk. Sting's greenlit. Dawn." Tasha exhaled, sinking back, Marcus hugging her tight, his arms a rare anchor. "We did it," he said, voice warm. She smiled, real for the first time in days, the basement's gloom lifting. At 5, the drone feed buzzed her phone, feds swarming Grayson's ranch again, this time with warrants that stuck. Agents kicked. In the door, dragged him out, his face a mask of fury. No technicality to save him now. Tasha watched, her grin widening, the screen flickering as they shoved him into a van. "He's gone," she whispered, turning to Marcus. "We got him." That victory held for 2 hours. At 7, footsteps thudded upstairs, heavy and wrong, too many for Marcus's quiet house. Her gut twisted, instincts screaming as she grabbed her Glock. "Marcus!" she called. But his face shifted, a flicker of something cold replacing the warmth. The basement door crashed open, SWAT flooding down, vests gleaming, rifles trained on her. "Drop it," one barked, and she froze, the gun clattering as Marcus stepped back, hands up, but eyes averted. Grayson stormed in behind them, free again, his smirk wider than ever. "Told you, Coleman," he said, voice dripping with triumph. "You're mine." Her world tilted, betrayal slicing through her like glass. "Marcus?" she choked, staring at him, but he wouldn't meet her gaze, his jaw tight. Grayson laughed, nodding at him. "Good work, partner. Price's offer was too sweet, huh?" Marcus flinched, and Tasha's knees buckled, the truth slamming home. He'd sold her out, tipped Grayson, traded her life for cash. The feds weren't here for him, they were here for her, the offshore sting a lie, a trap. "You bastard," she spat, lunging at Marcus, but a SWAT boot kicked her down, her ribs cracking against the cot. Grayson loomed, his breath hot. "Thought you'd outsmart me with your little accounts? I own the game." They tasered her, electricity jolting through her spine, her body convulsing as darkness clawed in. She hit the floor, Marcus's silhouette fading, his betrayal a knife deeper than Grayson's hate. The SWAT team hoisted her up, cuffs snapping tight, her vision swimming. Grayson's voice cut through the haze. "Price bought the judge, the feds, even your boy here. You're nothing now." She'd exposed the accounts, thought she'd won. But Marcus had flipped, and Grayson's crew had turned her triumph into chains. Her last thought as they dragged her out was Jamal alone again, and the sting of trust shattered. They tossed her into a van, the engine roaring as it peeled off, her head throbbing against the metal wall. Marcus's face burned in her mind. 3 years of partnership torched for Price's money, a racist system's perfect pawn. She'd saved Jamal, cracked Grayson's vault, watched him cuffed, only to see it unravel in a basement she'd thought was safe. Grayson's laugh haunted her, his power a hydra she couldn't slay. How had Marcus turned? She'd trusted him with her life, and he'd handed it to her enemy, leaving her caged, bleeding, and betrayed. The van lurched, and she vowed, through the pain, to claw her way back, to make them all pay. Tasha Coleman jolted awake, her skull throbbing as the van's rumble faded into silence, replaced by the drip of water echoing off rusted walls. Her wrists ached, still raw from the zip ties Marcus's betrayal had tightened, and her ribs pulsed, with pain from the SWAT kick in his basement. The hood was gone, yanked off sometime in the haze, and she blinked against the dim glare of a single bulb swinging overhead. She was in the same warehouse 15 miles north of Atlanta, Riley's blood still staining the floor, now joined by her own sweat and despair. It was July, the air thick with mildew and the stench of her own fear. Hours after Grayson's crew had tasered her into darkness. She was tied to a chair, ropes biting her arms, and he stood there looming, his smirk a blade in the gloom. Victor Grayson paced, his boots scuffing the concrete, his polo stretched tight over his gut, a predator, savoring his catch. "Woke up, huh?" he said, voice low and mean, stopping inches from her face. "Thought you'd bury me with your little bank trick, Coleman. You're dumber than I figured." She glared, her throat dry, tasting copper from a split lip. He leaned closer, his breath sour with whiskey, and launched into a tirade, words laced with venom. "You people always think you can rise up, don't you? Push in where you don't belong. I'm the law here, and you're just a who forgot her place." The slurs hit like punches, a racist sermon meant to break her, but she held his gaze, defiance burning through the pain. He smirked wider, nodding to a goon by the door, a hulking figure with a shaved head and a grin like a jackal's. The man grabbed a hose, dragging it over, and before Tasha could brace, Grayson barked, "Teacher!" Cold water blasted her face, slamming her head back, flooding her nose and mouth. She gagged, choking as it poured, the chair rocking under the force. He laughed, stepping back, watching her sputter, a sick ritual to drown her spirit. "That's what you get," he snarled, "for thinking you're better than me." The water stopped, leaving her soaked, shivering, gasping, but her eyes never left his. A silent vow. "You'll pay." How could a cop turn torture into a game? She coughed, water dripping from her chin, and spotted a glint in her sleeve, a pin she'd sewn in weeks ago, a backup no one checked. Her fingers, numb but alive, worked it free, slow and deliberate, the ropes masking her moves. Grayson ranted on, oblivious, his ego a shield thicker than steel. "Marcus sold you cheap, you know. Price offered him $100 grand, and he jumped, your own kind, turning on you." The betrayal stung fresh, a knife twisting deeper, but she focused, sawing the pin against the rope strand by strand. Could Marcus really trade her life for cash? She'd trusted him, bled with him, and he'd handed her to this monster. The goon stepped closer, cracking his knuckles, but Tasha kept cutting, her wrists slick with blood and water. Grayson crouched, eye level, his smirk a taunt. "Jamal's next than anyone else you love. I'll burn it all and you'll watch." Her heart lurched, rage surging, and the last rope snapped. She lunged, the pin flashing as she drove it into his thigh, a wet thud followed by his howl. He stumbled, clutching the wound, blood seeping through his jeans, and she bolted, chair crashing behind her. The goon roared, swinging, but she ducked, adrenaline pumping, and sprinted for the door, her wet sneakers slipping on the floor. She burst into the night, the warehouse lot a maze of shadows and gravel, the humid air slapping her face. Grayson's bellows echoed, "Get her!" But she didn't look back, weaving through rusted hulks, her lungs burning. A payphone glowed 50 yards off, a lifeline in the dark, and she reached it, slamming coins from her pocket into the slot. She dialed Lara, her voice a rasp. "It's me, North Warehouse. Grayson's got me pinned. Send backup now." Lara's reply was sharp. "On it, Tasha. Hold tight." She hung up, ducking behind a dumpster as headlights flared. Grayson's crew peeling out, guns gleaming in their hands. She crouched, heart hammering, thinking she'd made it. Back up en route, freedom close. Then tires screeched. A black SUV skidding in, not feds but Grayson's men. Their faces masked, eyes wild. She froze, the phone's echo still in her ears. But something was off. How did they find her so fast? Her stomach dropped as realization hit. Grayson had hacked her line, tapped her burner, turned her SOS into a beacon. The lead goon stepped out, grinning, and tossed a Molotov cocktail, flames exploding 10 yards away, a wall of heat and light. She stumbled back, the blast singeing her hair, and saw it, her childhood church 5 miles east, its steeple glowing in the fire. The blaze roared, a sacred black space, her sanctuary as a kid, now ash in Grayson's war. She choked on smoke, tears streaking her face, not from the heat, but the loss, the cruelty. The goon laughed, shouting, "She did it!" and sirens wailed. Cops closing in, Grayson's voice crackling over a radio. "Pin it on her, boys." Her escape had flipped, a trap snapping shut, and she ran, legs pumping, the church's ruin a scar on her soul. She'd stabbed Grayson, thought Lara's cavalry would save her, but he'd outplayed her, burned her past, and framed her again. The city spun, a nightmare she couldn't wake from, and she vanished into an alley, her breath ragged, her fight flickering but alive. She hid behind a stack of crates, the fire's glow fading, sirens dopplering away. Grayson's crew had torched her church, a racist strike to break her spirit, and pinned it on her. A lie the news would eat up. She'd escaped his ropes, thought she'd won a breath, but his hacked line turned her plea into a death sentence. Jamal was out there, Marcus a traitor, and now her sanctuary was gone, a message carved in flames. Nowhere's safe. She clenched, her fists the pin still slick in her palm, and whispered, "Not yet, bastard." She'd fight, but how? Grayson's reach was a vice, squeezing tighter, and every step she took seemed to fuel his fire. If you think Grayson's a monster for burning Tasha's church, comment number 1 below. Believe she's got the fire to keep fighting this racist nightmare? Hit that like button. Want to see her turn this pain into his ruin? Subscribe for the next drop. What's Tasha's next move when every call for help becomes a trap? Can she outrun a cop who turns her every escape into a cage? Tasha Coleman crouched behind the crates, the alley reeking of scorched wood and gasoline, the glow of her burning childhood church fading into the Atlanta night. It was hours past midnight, the July humidity plastering her wet clothes to her skin, her lungs still raw from the smoke of Grayson's latest strike. The pin she'd used to stab him dangled in her fingers, slick with his blood and her own, a tiny victory in a war she was losing. Her escape from the warehouse had flipped into a trap, her call to Lara hacked, and now the church, a sacred black haven where she'd sung hymns as a kid, was ash, another racist wound carved by Grayson's hands. She wiped her face, tears mixing with soot, and forced her legs to move. She couldn't stop, not with Jamal out there, not with Grayson's goons hunting her. The city pulsed with chaos, sirens screaming as news of the fire spread, Grayson's lie taking root. Tasha Coleman, fugitive arsonist, torches church. She slipped through back streets, her hoodie torn, her breath ragged, dodging cop lights that swept like searchlights. Riots erupted 5 miles south, black residents spilling into the streets, fists raised, voices roaring against the blaze they thought she'd set. Grayson had turned her people against her, a racist myth weaponized to isolate her. She needed to flip it, fast, before the mob became his army. Where could she turn when her own community saw her as the enemy? She remembered WATL, a pirate radio station run by a guy named Dex, an old contact from her undercover days. If she could broadcast the truth, she might claw back some ground. She trekked 10 miles west, her sneakers crunching glass from shattered storefronts, the city a tinderbox ready to blow. Dex's spot was a basement under a barbershop, its door unmarked, its signal a whisper on the dial. She banged on the steel, her knuckles raw, until Dex cracked it open, a lanky black man with a graying afro and wary eyes. "Tasha," he rasped, peering at her. "You're a damn ghost now," she pushed past, voice urgent. "Need your mic, Dex. Grayson burned the church, framed me. I've got to tell them." He hesitated, then nodded, leading her down to a cluttered room, a tangle of wires and a battered console glowing under a bare bulb. She grabbed the mic, her hands trembling, and Dex flipped the switch, static crackling as her voice hit the airwaves. "This is Tasha Coleman," she said, steady despite the ache in her chest. "I didn't burn the church, Victor Grayson did, a cop who's been bleeding us dry for years. He's framing me, killing us because I fought back. Check Riley Voss's blog, Price's emails, that's the truth." She paused, picturing Jamal's face, and added, "We're not the enemy, he is." Dex cut the feed, nodding. "It's how'd sister? Let's see if they bite. She slumped against the wall, the broadcast a lifeline thrown into the dark. Could her words pierce Grayson's lies? They did. Within an hour, the riots shifted, shouts turning from her name to Grayson's, the crowd swelling outside his precinct, 15 miles east. She watched on Dex's cracked TV, looters smashing cop cars, protesters chanting, "Grayson burns, not us." Her chest tightened, a flicker of redemption in the chaos. She'd rallied them, turned the tide, her voice a spark igniting their rage. Dex grinned, slapping the console. "You're a damn warrior, Tasha." She nodded, exhaustion tugging at her, but hope flared. The mob was hers now, a shield against Grayson's hunt. She'd flipped his frame up, made him the target. Was this the moment she'd reclaim her fight? That hope crumbled at 3 in the morning. The TV flickered, cutting to Grayson's face, live on every channel, his smirk intact despite the chaos. He stood on the precinct steps, flanked by riot. "Cops," his voice booming. "Tasha Coleman's a liar, a terrorist. This—" He held up a laptop, hers, snatched from Marcus's basement. Her confession, doctored by her own hands. The screen flashed to a video, her voice distorted but clear. "I burned the church, the feds, all of it. Grayson's innocent." Her jaw dropped, the forgery flawless, her own words twisted into a noose. The crowd faltered, boos rising, fists unclenching as Grayson played the martyr. "She's the enemy," he said, eyes glinting. "We'll restore order." Tasha's knees buckled, Dex cursing beside her. "That's not me," she whispered. But the damage was done. Grayson's tech had hacked her life, spun her broadcast into a trap, and now the mob turned again, their chants shifting. "Get Coleman!" She'd rallied them, thought she'd won their hearts, but he'd snatched it back with a lie so slick it felt true. Cops kettled the rioters, batons swinging, blood staining the pavement, black bodies falling under Grayson's law and order. She grabbed her bag, Dex pulling her arm. "Run, Tasha, they're coming." She bolted, the barbershop's back door slamming as boots thundered closer, her army lost to his deceit. She hid in a dumpster 5 blocks away, the stench of rot choking her, the city's pulse a war drum. Grayson's voice looped on a distant radio, gloating, while sirens wailed, hunting her. She'd turned the riots, thought she'd redeemed. Her name but his fake confession flipped it, a racist caricature of her as the villain sinking deep. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Nice try, Rat, check the skies." She peeked out, dread pooling, and saw drones humming overhead, red lights blinking, a sci-fi nightmare locked on her. Price's voice crackled on the news. "Martial law declared, Coleman's a threat, drones deployed." Her breath hitched, the city a cage, Grayson's counterattack a hammer smashing her defiance. She ducked deeper, the dumpster's lid creaking, her mind racing. Grayson had burned her church, framed her again, and now Price's drones turned Atlanta into his playground, hunting one black woman with tech she couldn't fight. She'd rallied a mob, thought she'd struck gold, but his forged video and martial law crushed it, leaving her cornered alone. Jamal was out there, the feds useless, and every move she made fed Grayson's trap. She clutched her pin, its edge her only anchor, and whispered, "Not over." But how could she run when the sky itself chased her? Tasha Coleman huddled in the dumpster, the rancid stench of rotting food clawing at her throat as drones buzzed overhead, their red lights slicing through the pre-dawn gloom. It was July, the Atlanta night, thick with humidity, hours after Grayson's. Forged video turned her radio triumph into a citywide manhunt. Martial law gripped the streets, Price's drones hunting her like a fugitive in a dystopian nightmare, their hum a constant threat. Her wet clothes clung to her skin, her ribs ached from Marcus's betrayal, and the pin in her hand, still crusted with Grayson's blood, felt like her last shred of fight. She'd rallied a mob, thought she'd flipped the script, but Grayson's. Lion Price's tech had caged her again. She couldn't run forever, not with Jamal out there, not with the sky itself against her. She peeked out, the drones circling wider, and spotted a sewer grate 10 yards off, a slim chance at cover. She bolted, gravel crunching under her sneakers, and pried it open with the pin, her fingers slick with sweat and grime. She dropped in, the dank tunnel swallowing her, water sloshing to her knees, the stench worse than the dumpster but safer than the streets. Her laptop, battered but alive in her bag, was her weapon now. She waded 20 yards, finding a dry ledge, and powered it up, the screen's glow a faint hope in the dark. Grayson's drones were military-grade, linked to precinct servers. If she could hack them, she'd turn his toys against him. Could she outsmart a system that owned the air? Her FBI training kicked in, fingers flying as she breached the precinct's network, a back door she'd planted months ago. She found the drone controls, a maze of code, and cracked it, rerouting one to crash into Grayson's station 15 miles east. The feed buzzed on her screen, the machine spiraling, slamming, into the precinct roof in a burst of sparks and twisted metal. She grinned, a feral edge to it, imagining Grayson's rage. She'd hit him where it hurt, a dent in his fortress, but the victory was fleeting. Her phone buzzed, a news alert. Drone crash, blamed on black terrorists, Coleman suspected. Her gut sank, the racist spin instant, Grayson's voice on air. She's arming radicals, endangering us all. The lie fueled a new wave, sirens blaring as cops flooded the streets, rounding up black residents, fists and batons flying. Tasha's screen flickered with footage, kids dragged from homes, elders cuffed, Jamal among them, his face bruised again. Hauled into a van, her breath caught, a scream trapped in her throat. Grayson had twisted her strike into a purge, targeting her people, her brother, a racist roundup to break her. She'd crashed the drone, thought she'd won a breath, but he'd turned it into a noose tightening around her family. She slammed the laptop shut, wading deeper, her mind racing. She had to free Jamal, hit Grayson harder before he crushed them all. She surfaced 5 miles north near the precinct, its lights blazing despite the crash. She ditched the hoodie, stealing a janitor's uniform from a dumpster, the grey fabric loose but enough to blend. Her leg throbbed, a limp slowing her, but she pushed on, slipping through a side door. The chaos of the drone hit, masking her entry. The holding cells were downstairs, a maze of steel and shouts, cops too busy to notice her. She found Jamal, his wrists cuffed, his eyes wide as she whispered, "It's me." She picked the lock, her pin bending but holding, and pulled him. Hout, his arm around her shoulder as they crept back up, her heart pounding. She wasn't done. In the server room, she planted a virus, a nasty bit of code she'd cooked up months ago, uploading it via a USB from her bag. It had leaked Grayson's files, every bribe, every lie, to the dark web. A digital bomb to gut him. She hit send, the screen flashing green, and dragged Jamal out. The precinct's alarms silent for now. They hit the streets, her limp worse, but she grinned, fierce and raw. The virus was live, files spilling online. Riley's blog lighting, up with leaks. Grayson's millions exposed. She'd freed Jamal, unleashed chaos, thought she'd finally cracked his armor. Was this the strike to end him? That hope shattered at dawn. A gunshot rang out, her leg exploding with pain as she fell, gravel biting her palms. Grayson emerged from a cruiser, his thigh bandaged from her pin, his smirk intact. A dozen militia goons at his back, rifles gleaming. "Nice try," he sneered, advancing, his gun trained on her. Jamal lunged, but a goon clubbed him down, his groan piercing her haze. She clutched her leg, blood soaking her pants, the virus's hum drowned by boots on pavement. Grayson towered. Over her, his voice cold. "Your little hack? Price's tech scrubbed it, files gone, but this?" He waved at the militia. "This is for you." They dragged her up, her leg screaming, and shoved her into a van, Jamal beside her, his head bleeding. Grayson climbed in, his radio crackling as he barked, "Roll the tape!" A screen flickered, live footage streaming, hostages, black residents. From the roundup, lined up outside the precinct, guns to their heads. "She did this," Grayson said to the camera, his voice booming. "Her terror made us act." A shot rang out, a woman falling, blood pooling, the crowd screaming as the feed cut. Tasha's vision swam, horror choking her people dying. On live TV, Grayson's racist execution pinned on her virus, her fight. The van lurched, her leg throbbing, Jamal's hand gripping hers, his eyes hollow. "Tash," he whispered. "What's he doing?" She couldn't speak, the weight crushing. Her. She'd crashed the drone, freed him, leaked the files, thought she'd won, but Grayson's militia turned it into a massacre, a public slaughter to break her soul. The hostages, her neighbors, died because she dared strike back. And the world watched, believing his lie. He leaned close, his breath hot on her face. "You're finished," he said, smirking. "Every move you make, I win bigger." She glared, blood dripping, her spirit flickering but alive. She'd hit him, thought she'd broken through, but he'd turned her defiance into death, and now she was his prisoner, the city his killing ground. They drove. The van's hum a dirge, her mind spinning. Grayson's power was a hydra. Every head she cut sprouting worse than this. This was his cruelest yet. Live executions, her name the trigger, a racist spectacle to bury her fight. She'd saved Jamal again, thought the virus was her ace, but he'd scrubbed it, turned it into a bloodbath. And now she was cuffed, bleeding, cornered. The pin slipped from her hand, clattering uselessly, and she whispered, "Not yet." Her voice a thread. But how could she rise when every victory fueled his terror? Tasha Coleman slumped in the back of the van, her leg throbbing with every jolt. The gunshot wound seeping blood through the makeshift bandage Jamal had tied from his shirt. It was dawn, the July heat already creeping into Atlanta's streets. Hours after Grayson's militia executed hostages on live TV, pinning the slaughter on her virus strike. Her wrists chafed under cuffs, her ribs ached from the beating, and Jamal sat beside her, his head bruised, his eyes hollow with fear. The van rumbled toward the courthouse, 15 miles south, Grayson's voice crackling over the radio. "She surrenders today, or more die." She'd crashed his drone, freed Jamal, leaked his files, thought she'd broken him, but he'd turned it all into a massacre, a racist lie that caged her again. Now he'd forced her hand. Face trial or watch her people bleed. The van stopped, doors banging open, and militia goons dragged her out. Her limp dragging gravel Jamal shoved behind her. Grayson loomed, his thigh bandaged from her pin, his smirk a taunt as he gripped her arm. "Time to play, Coleman," he said, voice thick with glee, pushing her toward the courthouse steps. The building towered, a grey slab packed with reporters, and a mob baying her name, their chants a mix of hate and confusion. She'd surrendered, not out of defeat, but strategy. The courtroom was her last battlefield, her truth against his lies. Could she turn this trap into his tomb? She straightened, pain screaming, and limped inside, her head high despite the blood staining her jeans. The courtroom buzzed, a sea of faces under harsh fluorescent light, wooden benches groaning under the weight of onlookers. Grayson sat at the defendant's table, his uniform crisp, his smirk intact, oblivious to her real rank. The jury filed in, all white, their eyes cold, sneers curling their lips as she shuffled to the stand, cuffs clanking. Judge Amos Reed, a paunchy white man with a buzz cut, presided, his gavel cracking the air, his voice a growl as he muttered slurs under his breath. "Damned troublemaker." Too low for the mic, but loud in her ears. The system was stacked, a racist wall she'd faced before, but she had one card left: her badge, her truth, and the audio from the warehouse. The prosecutor, a slick white guy named Paul Hensley, strutted forward, his suit gleaming, his tone smug. "Tasha Coleman, terrorist, arsonist, murderer. You crashed a drone, burned a church, killed innocents. Confess." She glared, her voice steady despite the rasp. "I'm no terrorist. I'm a supervisory special agent, FBI, 2 years undercover, tracking Victor Grayson's corruption." A gasp rippled through the room, Grayson's smirk faltering, his eyes narrowing as she dropped her bomb. She pulled her badge from her pocket, hidden through every beating, and slammed it on the stand, the gold glinting under the lights. "He's the criminal. Extortion, bribery, murder. I've got proof." The gallery erupted, reporters scribbling. Jurors shifting, Reed banging for order. Hensley scoffed. "A badge. Convenient forgery." But Tasha pressed on, her leg trembling but her resolve iron. "Check the warehouse audio," she said, nodding to Lara, who'd slipped in, a USB in hand. Lara strode forward, plugging it into the court system, and Grayson's voice boomed, raw and hateful. You people think you can rise up. I'll burn it all, and you'll watch. The room froze, the slurs, the threats, a confession carved. In his own words. Tasha locked eyes with a juror, a woman with pinched lips, and saw doubt flicker. Had she cracked their wall? Reed scowled, but the audio played on. Grayson's rant from her captivity, every racist vow a nail in his coffin. "Jamal's next," he'd said, and Jamal, beside Lara now, flinched, his bruises a silent witness. The jury stirred, whispers. Rising, Hensley stammering, "Objection, relevance," but Reed waved him off, his face red. Tasha seized the moment, her voice rising. "He framed me for the church, the drone, the executions. That video's fake, his accounts are real. Check Riley Voss's leaks, Price's emails. He's a monster, not me." The room tilted, Grayson's smirk gone, his fists clenched as the truth sank in. She wasn't just a fugitive, she was his hunter. The jury deliberated, 2 hours stretching like years. Tasha back in cuffs beside Jamal, her leg numb but her pulse racing. Grayson glared from his seat, his lawyer whispering frantically, but the air had shifted. Her badge a grenade he hadn't seen coming. At noon, the foreman, a wiry man with gray hair, stood, voice firm. "On all counts against Victor Grayson, guilty." A cheer erupted, drowned by Reed's gavel, and Tasha exhaled, her body sagging, a grin breaking through the pain. "On charges against Tasha Coleman," the foreman added, "not guilty." She hugged Jamal, his arms tight, tears streaking his face. She'd won, flipped his lies, caged him at last. Was this justice? That triumph lasted 10 minutes. As the bailiff moved to cuff Grayson, the doors crashed open, Leonard Price storming in, his suit pristine, his face a mask of fury. "Mistrial," he bellowed, waving a paper, his voice cutting the chaos. "Governor's pardon signed last night. Grayson walks." The room exploded, gasps and shouts, Tasha's heart plummeting as Reed squinted at the document, nodding slow. "Pardon's legit," he said, gavel cracking. "Case dismissed." Grayson leapt up, his smirk back wider, crueler, shaking Price's hand as the jury gaped, their verdict ash. Tasha froze, the air sucked from her lungs, Jamal's grip tightening. She'd won, thought she'd buried him, but Price's power, white and untouchable, snatched it away. Grayson swaggered over, his voice a hiss. "Told you, Coleman, I own this." He leaned close, breath hot. "Next time, no courtroom, just a bullet." He turned, the mob outside roaring, a militia chant rising, "Free Grayson, kill the snitch!" Price smirked, whispering to Reed, who nodded like a puppet, the system bending to their will. Tasha stumbled back, Lara catching her, her leg buckling, blood pooling anew. "We'll appeal," Lara said, but Tasha barely heard, the room spinning. She'd bared her soul, dropped her badge, played the audio, swayed the jury, only for Price's pardon to flip it, a racist shield she couldn't pierce. They dragged her out, Jamal at her side, the courthouse steps a gauntlet of jeers and fists. Cops holding the line as Grayson strutted free, his militia swelling, guns glinting in the sun. She'd thought the stand was her victory, thought justice had teeth, but Grayson's allies turned it to dust, leaving her exposed, bleeding, defeated. The crowd surged, a bottle smashing near her feet, and she limped away, Lara's arm her. Crutch, the chance a death knell. She'd fought 2 years, lost everything, won the jury, only to see him walk, his threat a shadow over her life. How could she stand when the system crowned him king? Tasha Coleman limped down the courthouse steps, the July sun blazing overhead, her leg a throbbing mess of blood and pain as the militia's chants echoed behind her. "Free Grayson! Kill the snitch!" Jamal clung to her side, his bruised face tight with fear while Lara steadied her other arm, her grip firm but trembling. The Atlanta air reeked of sweat and fury, the mob swelling 15 yards back, bottles and fists flying as Grayson strutted out, his smirk a beacon of triumph. Price's forged pardon had snatched her jury win, turned her badge and audio into ash, and left her exposed, a fugitive again despite the truth. She'd fought 2 years, lost Corey, Riley, her church, thought she'd caged him, but his white allies flipped it. A racist wall she couldn't breach. Now he was free, vowing her death, and the city bayed for her blood. She stumbled, her vision blurring, the gunshot wound soaking her jeans, but she forced her feet forward, Lara whispering, "Keep moving, we'll regroup." The crowd surged, a cop line buckling, and Grayson's voice boomed, "She's done, folks, justice served." His militia cheered, guns glinting, a promise of the bullet he'd threatened. Tasha's breath hitched, her hand slipping into her pocket, clutching the drone remote she'd synced in the sewer, a last ace from her virus strike. She'd crashed one into his precinct, thought it was gone, but the feed still hummed, a hidden camera on its wreckage, live and waiting. Could this turn his victory into ruin? She pressed the button, her thumb slick with sweat, and prayed. The courthouse TVs flared, hacked by her signal, the drone's grainy footage blasting across every screen. Grayson's voice, raw from the warehouse, "Burn it all, Jamal's next," followed by his execution order from the van, "Kill 'em, pin it on her." The crowd froze, gasps rippling as his militia spun, guns lowering, faces twisting in shock. Reporters scrambled, phones out, the feed going global, viral in seconds. Grayson's smirk fading as he whirled, spotting the screens. "No!" he roared, lunging at a TV, but it was too late. The mob turned, his own goons dropping rifles. Shouts shifting. "He lied, he's the killer!" Tasha grinned, blood dripping, her limp steadying as chaos flipped the tide. Grayson bolted, shoving Price aside, but the militia, his loyal dogs, turned feral, grabbing him, fists flying. "You set us up!" one bellowed, slamming him to the pavement, boots stomping as blood pooled, his screams drowned by their rage. Price fled, his suit tearing as he sprinted, the pardon's ink meaningless now, exposed as a fake on the drone's feed, a timestamp proving it predated the trial. The crowd surged, tearing at him too, a reckoning born from Tasha's last play. She sank to her knees, Jamal catching her, Lara shouting, "You did it!" as cops wavered, unsure who to cuff in the melee. Grayson's empire crumbled, a poetic fall at his own hands, but Tasha's strength ebbed, her body failing as she whispered, "They're still out there." Lara pulled her up, dragging her to an ambulance, the mob's roar fading as medics swarmed, her leg numb, her vision spotting. Black. She'd activated the drone, aired his truth, flipped his pardon into a noose and watched him fall. But Price vanished into the chaos, his shadow lingering. She clutched Jamal's hand, her voice a thread. "Upload it all," she told Lara. Nodding at her bag, the laptop's files a final blow to cripple Grayson's network. Lara nodded, sprinting off as Tasha sank back, the stretcher cold, her eyes fluttering shut. She'd won this round, turned his strut into a beating, but the war wasn't over. Not with Price's empire alive, a racist hydra waiting to strike. Sirens wailed, the ambulance lurching as medics worked, her pulse weak but stubborn. Grayson lay broken on the steps, his militia's fists his end, a justice she'd sparked but couldn't save her. Her badge, her fight, had torn his mask, but the cost scarred her. Corey, Riley, the church, now this blood-soaked day. She'd thought the courtroom was her win, thought the jury's word was final, but Price's pardon had flipped it, only for her drone to flip it back, a reversal that left her bleeding, victorious, yet hunted. A shadow loomed beyond the ambulance. Window, a figure in a dark coat watching silent still. Price, his allies. Her breath caught, the question unanswered as darkness took her, the fight unresolved, a war stretching past this shattered dawn. Tasha Coleman's relentless battle against Victor Grayson unveils profound truths about courage, systemic racism, and the cost of justice. Her journey teaches us that standing up to corruption, even when it wears a badge, demands unshakable resilience. Tasha faced betrayal, loss, and a city turned against her. Yet she wielded her intelligence and grit to expose Grayson's evil, proving that one voice can spark a reckoning, even against overwhelming odds. Her story underscores the brutal reality of racial injustice, where power shields the guilty and punishes the innocent, especially black individuals fighting for their communities. Grayson's ability to manipulate the system, through Price's pardon and media lies, reveals how deeply entrenched privilege protects its own, often at the expense of truth. Another lesson lies in the double-edged sword of trust. Marcus's betrayal cut Tasha deeper than Grayson's blows, showing that allies can turn when greed or fear outweigh loyalty. Yet her refusal to break, even when cornered, highlights the strength found in purpose. Hers was protecting Jamal and dismantling a racist empire. The drone reversal, flipping Grayson's victory into his downfall, teaches us that ingenuity can outmaneuver might, though not without scars. Tasha's collapse, with Price's shadow looming, reminds us that justice is rarely final. It's a war fought in increments, demanding vigilance beyond a single win. Ultimately, this tale urges us to question who holds power and why. It challenges us to see beyond headlines, to fight for the voiceless, and to recognize the cost borne by those who dare. What do you take from Tasha's fight? Comment below if her courage inspires you. Hit like if you stand against corruption, and subscribe for more tales of defiance. Share this if you believe truth can topple tyrants. Thanks for joining this journey. May you find strength to confront your own battles and hope in the face of darkness.